All right. Okay. So we have Dr. Phil Durrant with us today, and I want to thank Phil for his generosity to join us today. Probably this is about dinner time in the UK for most people. So yeah. So thank you again. Probably no, you will have a late dinner today. Okay, well, Phil is associate professor in language education at the University of Exeter, and I became interested in Phil's research when I was also myself more interested in collocations, and I pretty much love his 2009 paper in the English for Specific Purposes journal, where he looked at collocation in students in English for academic purposes students, right?
Yeah.
And I really found, back then so interesting to read, alternative approaches to studying collocations, what it meant to study collocations in academic writing. So, I mean, this is one of the papers I always recommend my students when it comes to collocations. Phil has published so much and so many interesting papers and research areas. One of them is academic vocabulary lists. I think you have a couple of things on that one, and also you've done syntactic complexity, looking at adverbial clauses with Brenchley and Clarkson. And of course, I suppose everybody wants to know more and wants to hear and wants to read your book, which I managed to finish after the summer, and I absolutely loved it. There's so much in here. It is unbelievable how much you guys managed to put in this book. I'm talking about understanding development and proficiency in writing, quantitative corpus linguistic approaches. So this is probably something that Phil will discuss and we talk about today. Just if you have questions for Phil, my suggestion is that you can make use of the chat box. Okay, well, Phil, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Great. Okay, I'll try sharing my screen then. Let me make sure that that's coming through. Are we there?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Pascal, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. Once again, it's great to have this opportunity to talk about my ideas with such a good audience. Pascal's obviously done a great job with promoting this. It's great to see such a good turnout. And thanks everybody for coming, whatever part of the day you're giving up to be here. I really appreciate the chance to share some ideas with you. What I'm going to talk about today, so it's researching writing development with the corpus, and it's not going to be a how to do this. It's not going to be a kind of a basic step-by-step thing. I want to take this time to reflect a little bit more broadly about the theory of understanding writing development with the corpus, and some of the ideas behind it, some of the things that we can infer from this kind of research, some things that we can't, and how we make sense of data in this kind of work. And I should say at the beginning, so Pascal was really kind to mention this book. I really wanted to bring this up just because I need to acknowledge the help of three great people who I've done a lot of work with. So a lot of the starting point for what I'm going to talk about today came from the Growth in Grammar project, which was a project that I did with Mark Brenchley and Debbie Myhill. And this was a corpus study of children's writing at schools in England. And especially thanks to Mark on that, who was the real sort of led the way on getting this project set up and doing a lot of the work on it. And the other thing is this book that Pascal mentioned, the Understanding Development and Proficiency in Writing, that I wrote with Mark and with Lee McCullum, who was my doctoral student at the time and has now recently started working at Coventry University. So a lot of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today came through, discussion and working with these people. All right, so what I'm talking about is writing development. So to start off, I'm going to talk about what I mean by writing development. So I think of writing development in terms of sort of two axes. One is thinking about how writing changes over time. And that really means not historical time, but educational time. So, as you go through, let's say, a particular course of study, let's say, I don't know, you're doing a foundation year program. How does your language change over the course of that program? You're a child at school. How does your writing change as you go from first form through to 11th form? So that's one aspect of writing development. And the other aspect is changes in quality. So not how your writing changes as you go through education, but what's the difference between, let's say, good writing and not so good writing. And this, again, in the research that's been done, I think sometimes implicitly, there's two different approaches to this. So one is studies which look at rate evaluations. So they'll quantify quality in terms of what score does someone give to this piece of writing. But then a slightly different way of thinking about it is the proficiency of the person who wrote it. So sometimes people doing this sort of research don't look at the grade given to a piece of work, but they look at the proficiency level of the person who wrote it. So that's a slightly different way of thinking about changes in quality. So when I talk about writing development, I've got all of these things in mind, and I'm really interested in how writing changes across these different variables. How is better writing different from less good writing? And how is the writing of a less mature writer or someone near the beginning of a program of study different from the writing of a more mature writer or someone towards the end of the program of study? Now, obviously, as the title and the series suggests, I'm really interested in using a corpus to study this. So why would you want to use a corpus to study writing development? The reasons for this are really similar to the reasons you'd want to use a corpus to study anything. So I got these under sort of three main headings. One is that corpus research is an observational method. We don't have to go out and do an experiment. We don't have to intervene in the real world. And that gives it, in the best case, a contextual authenticity, because we're not going out and eliciting the text that we want students to write, or we're not putting them in an artificial condition and asking them to do some writing. We can go out and collect some writing that they've done as part of their normal life. In an education, obviously, that's often things that they write for assignments, things that they write for their schoolwork, things that they write for an exam. So all of these things are contextually authentic in an educational setting, and we're not intervening with the process. So that's one advantage of using a corpus. Another is that using a corpus forces us to be explicit about the things that we're studying. If you're going to get a computer to search for a particular linguistic feature in a corpus, you need to tell that computer exactly how to find that linguistic feature. So you have to be very clear about what you mean by it. If you're going to study a subordinate clauses, you have to be very clear about what you mean by subordinate clauses, or else the corpus program isn't going to find it for you. That's got two advantages, I think, two big advantages. One is that it makes the research transparent, which is always a good thing. And the other is that it means that your findings can be quite specific. You don't end up with kind of vague generalities that you quite often get with more sort of subjectively oriented research, qualitative research. You can talk about particular features and their particular effects. And I think from a pedagogical standpoint, that's helpful. If you can give some specific information to a teacher, that's a really helpful thing. The final set of advantages are to do with the fact that a corpus enables you to study large samples of writing all at the same time. There's some really obvious advantages of this. One is that you can make generalizations. Another is that you can study variation across contexts. So we can not just look at, let's say, development over time, but how that interacts with different types of texts or different contexts that people are working in. And then finally, to me, the killer advantage here, the thing that made me really excited about corpus linguistics when I first got into it, was the idea that you can get surprising patterns coming out, that things can come out of the data that you weren't expecting to find. John Sinclair has this line about the language looking different when you look at a lot of it at once. And to me, that's the great thing about corpus linguistics, is that you can find things that you didn't know were going to be there. And I often like this, to use this metaphor, to think about that kind of advantage. So this, I don't know if you're familiar with this painting. This is a Salvador Dali painting. And it's you can see it sort of a painting of, there's kind of a boiling sky in the background, kind of red, and some kind of sun thing happening in the middle. Maybe looks like there's something coming out of the sun. There's a woman looking up at it, and then down below that there's kind of a picture of Abraham Lincoln down in the bottom, and then there's the woman again in a slightly different pose standing next to him. So you can see all of that in the painting. And the place where, so you can see this painting at the Salvador Dali Museum in South Florida, at St. Petersburg, South Florida. And the way they've got it displayed there is that it's at the end of a long hallway. So they've got this on one wall, and when you see it, you're kind of encouraged to turn around and walk away and walk to the other end of the hall, where you can look at it from a long distance. And when you look at it from a long distance, this is what it looks like. Okay, so suddenly we have sort of shrunk down. We get that picture of Abraham Lincoln that was in the bottom of the painting actually is the whole painting itself. And to me, this is a really nice, I suppose, metaphor for what happens when you deal with large samples in any kind of research, including in corpus linguistics, is it enables you to stand back from the small details. And when you do this kind of research, you lose a lot of detail. But by losing that detail, it gives you a perspective that helps you see something else, that helps you see something that you couldn't see if you were standing up really close to it. Okay, so these are the reasons that I like corpus linguistics for studying, or anything at all, but particularly writing development. And, you know, lots of people, well, okay, so here's a couple of examples of the sorts of findings that you can get. So these are just two quick examples from some of my research with children's writing. Vocabulary diversity. So this is looking at controlled type token ratio over 4 different year groups: year 2, year 6, year 9, and 11 in English children's writing, or children of the writing of children in English schools. And in 2 different genres of writing: literary writing, so that's basically stories, and non-literary writing, so that's kind of all the more academic stuff that they do. And we can see really clearly that the diversity of children's writing increases as they get older, and we can see that that increases a great deal more in the literary writing. So when children are writing stories, that's where they're really starting to exercise the full diversity of their vocabulary, and that gap really opens up after year 6. Another example, so this is looking at noun phrase complexity. So this is the number of words on average per noun phrase in children's writing. And again, we get this nice linear increase across the year groups, and this time kind of similar between the literary writing and the non-literary writing. All right, so that's the kind of nice, neat, large-scale patterns that you can start to find with a corpus analysis that you might not spot if you were just reading individual texts. Okay. And a lot of people are very conscious of the benefits of this. Thus, there's been a lot of programs written. So things like Cometrics, the suite of tools that Chris Carl and Scott Crossley have worked on, the online things, Complete Web Vocab Profiler and Text Inspector, Lawrence Anthony's Ant Word Profiler, and a lot of people also getting into working with R and with Python to do this kind of research, to program their own analyses with this. So, the fact that these things are so widespread now, I think, is a good indication of how popular this way of studying writing has become. Okay, so that's the setup. That's where I'm telling you all the things that I like and how popular it is. The rest of the presentation, I'm going to tell you what all the problems are. The center of what I want to say is really that graphs like the ones that I've just shown you disguise a lot of complexity. So I talked about the Dali picture and how by losing the detail, you see a bigger picture. And what we're looking at in these graphs is really that big picture. We're seeing what it looks like at a distance without all the details. But it's important not to forget about those details. It's important not to forget to go up and look again closely and see what all the details are underneath that. Because these sorts of graphs can disguise a lot of complexity. And if we're not aware of what that complexity is, we can misinterpret our data. We can think they're telling us something that they're not really telling us. So the message here is that without understanding the complexity that underlies these nice clean graphs, we can't really understand what our quantitative findings are telling us. All right, there's two types of complexity that I'm going to talk about that I think we all need to think about when we're doing this sort of research. And the first one is complexity related to the process of writing. Now, there's lots of models out there for the process of writing. And I've just picked on this one because this is one we picked up on when we were writing the book and we've kind of stuck with it. But there are many others out there which would really give the same message, I think. And what I think we learn from this model, so we can see that when we write, so there's language competence involved in that process of writing. And that's represented on the left-hand side, language competence, which can be linguistic competence, sociolinguistic competence, discourse competence. There's also knowledge of the world. There's also an online processing assembly, so a kind of a psycholinguistic process that you go through. And all of this is related to internal goal setting. So as a writer, you're setting yourself a job that you need to complete, and you're setting that while you're conscious of the participants, so who you're writing for, the setting. So that could be interpreted in lots of different ways. The setting of the text more broadly, how will it be read, under what conditions will it be read. And you can also think of it in terms of the process of writing itself. So when you're writing, are you using a computer or a pen and paper? Are you in a noisy room or are you somewhere comfortable? Have you got access to a dictionary? Or are you in an exam without access to that sort of thing? It's influenced by the task. What have you been asked to actually do in this piece of writing? By features of the text, the topic that you're writing on. So all of these things go into creating a piece of text. And when we do corpus linguistics, we're capturing all of it at the same time. So it's the output of this whole system that we get. It's not the output of one part of it. Now, that can be problematic for people who are interested in language, because language competence is only one small part of this. So if we want to use these methods to learn about language learning, that link between the language that you know and what goes on the piece of paper is highly mediated by a lot of other things. So we can't make a direct inference from what we see in the corpus to what the writer knows. So that means that we can't make a direct inference from our findings of change over time or change across a variable of quality to a claim about language learning. Now I've got some, I want to illustrate that a little bit now. And also to give you a kind of a model. So this is a rough and ready model for what I think we need to think about when we're interpreting learner corpus data. So at the center of everything, what we're studying is language in use. But that language use is, I think, influenced at the very least by, well, on the one hand, our language abilities, but also by the subject content, so what it is that we're writing about, the teaching context, so what's happened in the classroom, what have we been told, how we've been set up to do this task, our own knowledge, our general cognitive skills, the communicative goals that we have, the conventions of the register that we're writing in, and our understanding of the audience. And I think we need to keep all of these things in mind when we're studying language in use, as we do with the corpus. So getting on to some concrete examples now. This is a letter from the Growth in Grammar corpus. This was written by a year 2 student in an English school. So I'll just give you a minute to read through that. Okay, so there's a year 2 letter. This is the start of a letter by a year 11 student. Okay, so there's obviously a lot going on here. Now, these 2 texts are the sort of things that we might study if we're studying writing development. So we might want to know, how do texts written by year 2 students differ from texts written by year 11 students? How does their language differ? Now, we can see already in these 2 short excerpts lots of ways in which they are similar and lots of ways in which they differ. So just to highlight a couple of key things, we've got stuff like the things bolded here. And these are, I would say, typical features of a letter that's requesting help. Okay, so we've got some classic features of letters. So it starts off with dear person name, kind of in a formal way. So it hasn't used the first name, it's Dr. K. Fisher. And it finishes up with the writer's name, Freezing Brown Squirrel. It starts off by introducing the writer, telling the recipient who the writer is, and finishes with an explicit plea for help. So what these things are showing us, I think, is something about register conventions, something about a sense of audience awareness. So the writer is thinking about who's going to read the letter and how that person should be addressed. And also about the communicative goals of this letter, what the letter is trying to achieve, so that the letter is trying to get the Dr. Fisher to help the poor squirrel. Okay. Similarly in the second one, so again, it starts off with the salutation, this time slightly more formal. So it's not gone for the actual name, probably because this is anonymous. So they don't actually know the name of the person they're writing to, because this is a different type of letter, right? It's still a letter, but this time it's a letter to the editor of a newspaper. And the communicative purpose here is not to elicit help, but to criticize something that that the writer of this has read in the newspaper. And we can see a really, it's in some ways similar. So starting off with dear, and again, starting off with I, but this time it's bringing in a whole different set of linguistic features. So the although, starting with a concession marker, setting up a point of view which you might hold as the editor of the newspaper, and then contrasting it with the writer's own thoughts. And then a lot of evaluative language, so appalled, biased, I believe, and then a couple of kind of logical connection things. So as to give a reason, and then thus to give state a logical conclusion. Now, I think it's probably likely that the year 2 writer, the person who wrote the letter from the squirrel, isn't able to use words like bias and thus and appalled. But also, it's true that if they had put that in this letter, those words would have been completely out of place, because the letter isn't, it's not part of the communicative goal of this letter to make criticisms, to evaluate something, or to make concessions to the reader, or to construct an argument. That's not what they're trying to do here. If someone tried to construct a critical argument in basically a begging letter, then it wouldn't have a positive response. So, perhaps the vocabulary that we're seeing here and the structures we're seeing here are a reflection in a way of this year 11 person's language abilities, but they're also a reflection of the different communicative goals of the two letters. Okay. The second thing that I noticed here that really stood out for me were conjunctions. So in the first letter, most of the conjunctions are very simple. So we've got 3 coordinating conjunctions: and appears twice, and then but. And then we've got a really simple subordinator, until, which introducing an adverb of time, which is, when in children's writing, this is the kind of the first form of subordination that they often pick up on, is these adverbs of time. So, it's all clear, but very simple use of coordination here. In the year 11 article, it's much more complicated. So we've got that concession marker that I talked about already, although. Then we've got displaying, we're introducing this adverb of manner. And then we've got as, introducing an adverb of reason. And then we've got thus, again, drawing a logical inference. So what we're seeing here, I think, is both a whole bunch of linguistic of words and structures, which perhaps the year 2 student can't use. I don't know. They haven't given evidence of being able to use subordinate clauses beyond a simple adverb of time. So maybe they just don't know how to use these kind of things. We could also perhaps think that there's a difference in cognitive skills here. So the message which is being conveyed here is quite complex. This idea of giving a concession and then responding to that concession. The idea of drawing a logical inference from just something you've just said. The idea of stating a reason for something that you've just said. So these are not just linguistic differences, they're differences in the type of cognitive skills that the two writers are exhibiting. Now, when we're drawing conclusions from this data, should we be saying just that the language has changed? Should we be saying that the language has changed and their cognitive skills have changed? I think that's something which needs a lot of thought. All right, the final thing I wanted to pick up was the vocabulary, and in particular, vocabulary sophistication. So this is a really commonly used definition of vocabulary sophistication from John Reed: selection of low frequency words that are appropriate to the topic and the style of writing, rather than just general everyday vocabulary. And the way that most people have actually used this in the literature is that they focused on the selection of low frequency words, that if someone uses low frequency words, that's sophisticated. So thinking about the low frequency words in these two texts, in the year 2 letter, about 11% of the vocabulary comes from outside the most frequent 5,000 words in English, or the 5,000 band plus. So, on a frequency-based framework, that's actually pretty sophisticated. And I got this data using the online vocabulary profiler from LexTutor. So all of these words, smooth, fuzzy, squirrel, mossy, blank, snowball, cozy, comfy, nest, all of these things were 5,000 word level or above. So quite infrequent. Now, if we do the same thing for the year 11 letter, there was just one word. So that's just over 1% of this part of the letter, which was at the same level of supposed vocabulary sophistication. So if we say that low frequency vocabulary is sophisticated vocabulary, that means that the year 2 letter is actually a lot more sophisticated than the year 11 letter. Now, would we want to say that? Probably not. And we probably also wouldn't want to say that the year 2 writer knows more vocabulary or is better at vocabulary than the year 11 writer. You know, I bet this year 11 writer knows all of these words. I bet they know what a squirrel is, and they can use the word smooth and fuzzy in a sentence if you ask them to. But this task doesn't call for it. Now, in this letter, it's not writing about squirrels. It's not writing about things that are fuzzy. It's writing about a charity. It's criticizing a newspaper article. It's talking about something being biased. So it's talking about things that are just in the corpus more common. Okay. Now, scaling this up, when I did an analysis of the vocabulary across the whole of our corpus, I actually found that this was kind of a regular thing, that that younger children actually tended to use, particularly nouns, more low frequency nouns than the older children. So you can see these sort of upwards trend in the graph, where if vocabulary sophistication was really about just about frequency, we'd probably expect it to be going the other direction. We'd probably expect the young children to use high frequency vocabulary and the older children to use low frequency vocabulary. And, you know, but actually what we find is it's the youngest children who are using the lowest frequency vocabulary. And what I've got here is a list of some of the low frequency vocabulary they use. So we can see it's a lot of stuff to do with kind of magic and fantasy, you know, things like abracadabra and cauldron and fairyland. A lot of things to do with animals that perhaps adults don't talk about very much. So meerkats and jackals and hedgehogs and burrows and cobwebs. Some nice descriptive words like bolt and bang, mash. So what we're seeing here, I think, is children, the youngest children, dealing with some topics which turn out to be low frequency in adult corpora. So what should we conclude from this? Well, I think to understand these data, to understand this trend that I'm finding here, we need more than a theory of language learning. So a theory of language learning might say, well, does say, we learn high frequency items first. And that theory of language learning is really misleading in this sense, because we need to know something broader. We need to know something probably about the topic, the fact that the topics that these younger learners are writing on are quite different in type from the topics that the older children are writing on. And that has an impact on the sorts of vocabulary that they're using. And that means that any direct inference to language proficiency is suspect. So that's what I started this section with, right? So when I looked at that diagram of the writing process, I said, well, you know, there's all this stuff happening when you write. There's all these influences on what actually ends up on the page. And because of that, if you make an inference from your corpus results directly to language proficiency, there's something, you know, that's not something you can do directly. It's always mediated by other things. So any move from saying, I found this in my corpus, therefore I can state this about language learning or about this student's language proficiency, that jump, I think, is always a little bit dodgy. Okay. The next thing that I want to focus on is teaching context. So you'll remember that in that graph of that chart of different influences on writing that I mentioned, the things that we have to think about when we interpret corpus data, one of them was the teaching context. And I want to talk about this because there's a really nice example in my corpus of how teaching context has a big effect on what appears in the texts. So this one's a little bit tricky to read, so I'm going to read it out for you. So it starts, should gingerbread man be eaten? We have been discussing whether gingerbread man should be eaten or not. Many people believe that the gingerbread man should be eaten because firstly, he is quite mean and he runs away from the cow and the silly old horse. Secondly, the cow and the silly old horse are hungry. On the other hand, people disagree. They think gingerbread man shouldn't be eaten. In conclusion, there are many great reasons why gingerbread man shouldn't be eaten, because he wouldn't fill the animals up. But I believe he shouldn't be eaten because he is tiny. I think he should be eaten because he might feel angry and chase the animals. What do you think? Okay, so as an argument, it's not very convincing. I would disagree with some of the ideas put forward in this argument. I don't think it's watertight logic, but there's obviously a very clear structure here. There's should, verb. We've been discussing whether, should, verb. Many people believe that because, firstly. Secondly, on the other hand, in conclusion, there are many great reasons why. What do you think? So when you look at this, it's got a really clear, strong framework of an argument that it's been built around. And obviously this has implications for the analysis of the language. You know, when you're analyzing this, you can see these subordinate clauses coming in. You can see interesting marks of cohesion, like firstly and secondly. You can see these adverbial clauses starting because. There's a whole lot here that we would find if we analyze the grammar and the vocabulary and the cohesion of this text that would really show up in a corpus analysis. And when you read it, you get the strong impression that the teacher has helped a lot here, that the teacher has kind of given them this framework to hang their argument around. And when you look at other texts in the corpus, it becomes very obvious that yes, that's what's happened. Because we see a whole bunch of other, well, sometimes the same person writing on a different topic, but sometimes other people writing similar, writing text with a similar structure. So here's one. Should the SpongeBob live under the sea? We've been discussing whether SpongeBob should live under the sea. Many people believe that SpongeBob should live under the sea because firstly, he soaks up water. Secondly, he washed the rocks in the sea. On the other hand, many people believe he should not live in the sea because he's not a fish. In conclusion, there are many great reasons for and against the SpongeBob should live under the sea because there's his house. What do you think? So this is a different student writing about a different topic, but you can see again that it's got exactly the same structure. Okay, so clearly the teacher has given them this structure to work with, and they're getting it wrong. You know, each time they copy it out, they're copying it differently. So perhaps they've made notes in their notebook and they're copying it from there, or perhaps the teacher's got it on the board and they're just copying it down badly. You know, they've actually they've made different spelling mistakes. And they've included different parts of it, but you can see they've been given the same framework to work with. And I can imagine, you know, this classroom that the teacher's given them this framework, and then they've done some kind of class brainstorming. You know, they've done a topic about SpongeBob living under the sea or eating the gingerbread man, and different children have given different ideas for and against the argument. And then they've taken those ideas and written them down and combined them into this text, which is probably why especially the first text is so self-contradictory. I think it's probably taken down different ideas that different people have said and ended up with a bit of a mess. And then just one final example, we've got, should school be open 5 days a week? We've been discussing whether school should be open 5 days a week. Many people believe that school should be open 5 days a week because firstly, we learn more in the classroom. Secondly, we get to see our friends more. On the other hand, many people believe school shouldn't be open 5 days a week. This because want more time to play with the toys. Okay, so again, we've got the same thing. Now, if we just did a corpus analysis, including these texts, we would get this big spike here of a whole bunch of really interesting grammatical features. Like I mentioned, some types of subordination, we've got these cohesion markers, all of these things would suddenly spike up when we're looking at these children's writing. And unless we go back and look at this teaching context and see what's actually happened here, we don't understand the reason for that spike. We don't know why that's happened. And a real example of how this can play out in real research. So in a paper that I did with Mark and with another colleague, Becky Clarkson, we were looking at the frequency of adverbial clauses in children's writing. And this was our overall trend. So similar to the graphs that I showed you at the beginning, this is the big kind of stand back, forget the details, see the big picture kind of message. And the thing that really stood out for me here was the blue line. So that's non-literary writing. So that's things that aren't stories. Adverbial clauses increased in a quite substantial way from year to year across the course of education. And when you look at it in a bit more detail, so I broke this down into different types of adverbial clauses, depending on the function. So what were they doing with the adverbial clause? And the thing that really stood out for me here was this. So the most common type of adverbial clause was an adverbial clause giving a reason for something. And what we see is there's this massive jump from year 9 to year 11, right? And I thought, my first instinct here was that there's some mistake. There's something strange in the data. Perhaps it's all data from one particular class. Perhaps there's one particular group of students who've been drilled on adverbial clauses of reason, or perhaps there's one student who appears in the corpus 10 times and he just uses it all the time. But it wasn't the case. I found that these adverbial clauses of reason occurred across different schools, different students, different topics in year 11 writing. But well, okay, so just to highlight what I'm getting at here, these are examples of adverbial reason clauses. This is what they look like. So things like I believe that festivals shouldn't be banned because it brings excitement and joy to people from all areas. They slapped the water with such force, people jumped out of their seats thinking it was a clap of thunder. So here it's giving the reason why something has happened. Furthermore, although at first there appears minimal evidence that she is kind, in fact she soothed and consoled her father by reading to him fiction books, suggested by the quotation he liked them. So this is a reason clause in the sense of it's giving evidence for the thing that's just been claimed. Now, when I looked at year 9 and year 11 writing and broke it down by discipline, this really strong pattern came out that for English subject writing, so they're writing critiques of Macbeth and that sort of thing, there was no real difference between year 9 and year 11. But in science writing, there was a big jump. So why? What happened? Why was there this big jump in year 11 science writing? Well, it turns out, if you look at the task they're being asked to do, this is related to the national exams, the GCSE exams that children do at age 16. At year 9, they're being asked to describe things. They're being asked to report on things. But at year 11, suddenly all of the questions has an explicit why question in. Why does this happen? Suggest reasons for something happening. So this was the reason for this big jump in adverbial clauses at that age. Okay, so some interim conclusions. The language that we find in texts, it reflects multiple competencies and features of the writing context at the same time. It's not just showing us what someone knows about language. That means that interpretations are not straightforward. We can't just go from the corpus data to say something about language knowledge. Development in language abilities can't be separated from other factors. And in fact, it shouldn't be separated from other factors, because I think the evolution in the types of texts that you write and the types of topics that you write on, the kinds of registers that you use, that's part of the learning process. So in the article that I wrote with Mark and Becky, I said this. I said that learning to write is about gaining parallel mastery over particular text types and the linguistic forms that are associated with those types. And there's really not much to be gained from trying to pull those things apart. Okay, the second type of complexity is the complexity in the corpora that we're dealing with. So what I mean here, on the one hand, we need to think about the nature of the learner corpus that we're dealing with. So as we've already seen, you get clusters in the corpus that are due to a particular topic or task. So we saw with the argumentative essays that the young children were writing, there's a cluster of children from the same school who are writing on a particular topic. They've been given a particular task, and those clusters have an effect on the outcome. We get clusters due to the teaching context, we get clusters due to individual writers. And this is the key reason why everyone needs to use mixed effects models when they're doing their analysis. So that's the learner corpus. We also need to think about the reference corpus. In particular, we need to think about what the reference corpus that we're using actually represents. Now, we use a reference corpus if we're doing something like looking at vocabulary frequency. So when I talked about the low frequency words in the earlier example, the frequency of those words was based on a reference corpus. And when we're using a reference corpus, we have to be really careful with thinking about what that reference corpus actually represents. And I'd like to suggest that there's really three types of reference corpus that you could use. One is what I'd call a peer target corpus. So we could use as a reference corpus writing by successful writers at the same level. Okay, so for year 6 writers, the reference corpus is good writing by other year 6 writers. For year 11 writers, the reference corpus is good writing by other year 11 writers. And the advantage of that is that it enables us to see how they compare with the demands of writing at that level. So because the types of text that you have to write at year 11 are different from the types of tasks you need to write at year 6, it gives a fair comparison. But the disadvantage of that is that you can't look at development over time. Because we need a different reference corpus for each level of education, that means that we don't have a constant measure that we're using across all the different stages. So for that, I think we need what I'd call a prospective targets corpus. So that's something that they're aiming to get to in the future. All right. So that might be, for example, good adult writing would be a prospective target corpus. And that's something that we could keep constant right from year 2 through to year 11, or from beginner level L2 writing through to advanced level L2 writing. And then a third type is an input corpus. So if we're working with children, for example, we might take a corpus of children's books as the reference corpus. And I think that would be useful if you want to learn something about how input relates to learning. So if you've got like a usage-based theory that you're trying to test, in that case, some kind of input corpus would be really useful as a reference corpus. I'm going to give an example of an issue that came up for me when I was using a prospective target corpus. And I was using this to try and study the register appropriateness of vocabulary. So my idea was, well, I want to know if children in my corpus are using words that are appropriate for the register they're writing in. And I did this by drawing on the word lists that come from the COCA corpus, the Corpus of Contemporary American. And based on the frequencies of words in that corpus in different registers, I gave scores for words according to how biased they were towards that register. So in this example, the word opposition, you can see it scored a 0.3957 on academic, but 0.018 for fiction. So in other words, this word was much more associated with academic writing. It was much more common in academic writing than in fiction. So it's kind of an academic-y word. Whereas a word like reporter or newspaper were newspaper type words. They were words that appeared more frequently in the newspapers than the others. So using this prospective corpus, the COCA corpus, a corpus of adult writing, not child writing, I specified how closely related these words are to particular registers. And I wanted to know, as children go through their education, do they tend to use, let's say, more academic words, less fiction words, more magazine-like words? How does that work out? And I also wanted to know how it related to the discipline they were writing in and the genre they were writing in. So a result from this that really stood out was to do with the magazine-type words. And what I found here was that for literary English writing, non-literary English writing, and writing in the humanities, it was all kind of low, so that they used them more in primary school than in secondary school, but they were low overall. But science really stood apart from all of the others. Science used way more magazine-type words than all of the other disciplines. I thought, oh, that's strange. Why on earth would that be? Why would magazine words be so common in science writing? So to chase that up, I went and had a look at what were the magazine words that these children were using. So this is just from the year 6 writing. This is a set of magazine-type words. And what struck me when I looked at this, and I hope this will strike you as well, is that these actually look like very sciencey words. Very few of them look like they would be out of place in a piece of science writing. There are a few which don't look very sciencey, but all of the others really do. And when I checked them, I found that all of these actually occur in dictionaries of science and technology. So these are fine academic, scientific type words. So the question then becomes, why are these sciencey words rated as magazine words by the COCA corpus? Why do they appear so frequently in magazines in COCA, in my reference corpus? My first thought was, well, probably there's lots of popular science writing in the corpus. But it turned out that wasn't the reason. It turned out that the main source of this came from what Mark Davies calls health and home type magazines. In fact, 41 of the 60 high frequency, strong magazine word types came from this category. And these were things to do with food. They were things to do with health and nutrition. And they were things to do with gardening. And it just happens that the topics of food, health and nutrition, and gardening are also really popular in school science writing, especially in the younger years. So at year 6, it was at its highest. So what this was really telling us about was not something about language development or language learning. It was about the subject content that was happening in the science writing, and the fact that the topics that people write about in school science subjects are actually quite similar to the sorts of topics that people write about in these home and health magazines, gardening and nutrition and fitness and so on. Okay, so bringing this to a close. As I said at the beginning, I think corpus methods have great potential for understanding writing development. They're authentic, they're large scale, they force you to be explicit. All of that is wonderful. People should try and use this. But interpretation isn't straightforward. When you're dealing with text in a corpus, all of this stuff is influencing the language at the same time. And you definitely can't make an inference just from the language to the language ability of the writers. We need to think hard about the details of the corpora. So we've got these clustering of text in the corpus where people are in the same context, people are writing about the same topic, we've got the same writer appearing again and again. You need to think about the types of reference corpus you're using, and you choose those types of reference corpus depending on the aims of your study. And you also need to think about the contents of the reference corpus. So it took me a long while to dig into COCA to figure out why these magazine words were so scientific. So corpus data on writing development tells us much more than just language development. We need to consider the complexity of the writing process and of the corpora used. An interpretation of quantitative patterns requires extensive study of and reflection on texts, corpora, and their contexts. So going back to this, we need to do that standing back, but also we need to keep coming back close up and looking at detail at what's going on, what's behind those big, those nice clean graphs that we get when we do the quantitative analysis. Okay, there's my references. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Phil. I was hoping you could give us more examples of these kids writing. All right. Well, thank you again.
They're really fun to work with. It's one of the best things about working in this area is that, especially the young children's writing, is just delightful to read.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so please, everyone, feel free to drop your questions. We have a few minutes for Q&A, so that would be really useful. We had a few questions here. So, for example, we have Nasreen Triki. So the question is, which software have you used to extract and classify their nouns?
I used R. So this was based on, we did a manual analysis of the, so when you say nouns, I assume you mean the noun phrases. I hope I've understood that right. So I assume you're talking about complexity in the noun phrase. So that was based on, a manual hand coding of the texts. We had a subset of 240 texts, which we had a group of people code for syntax. And then we used some R programs that we wrote ourselves to identify the size of the noun phrases and the different types of modification that were happening in the noun phrases. So that was that. If you the other type of noun that I mentioned was the frequency of the nouns in the children's writing and how that they increased in frequency. And again, that was a custom-made program. So I used the frequency lists from Coca. So again, though, you can download those, I think, from Mark Davies's website. And then I, again, wrote an R program to match up the words in our texts with the frequencies on that list.
All right, great. We have a similar question from Ainur Aksadi. Do corpora allow us to automatically generate results about the use of clauses?
Well, it depends on what. So just the corpus by itself won't do that. So you need to have the corpus annotated in some way. So you need either a machine or a human being to go through and identify those types of clauses that you're interested in. So let's say you're interested in adverbial clauses, like I was interested in. Again, we had a team of annotators who went through our texts and found the different types of clauses in those texts and marked them. So our corpus had all of these tags in saying, there's this type of clause here, and there's this type of clause here. And once you've done that, then you can write a program to find how many of those there are in each text. If you can't do that manually, there is some software that will do it for you automatically. So there are automated parsers that exist, like the Stanford NLP parser. So that would do a similar thing, but it will do it automatically. If you're using something like that, then you need to be really careful to do some checks to make sure how accurate it is. Because when you're taking something like that and applying it to learner texts, it can make mistakes, and especially depending on the type of feature that you're interested in. So even if the parser has got a good overall accuracy for all of the language features it looks at, it might not be so accurate for the feature that you're interested in. And then there's also some software like Chris Kyle's Task program, which kind of brings everything together by both doing the parsing and doing the count. So that kind of saves you some effort in that it will apply the Stanford NLP parser to it, and then it will count a whole bunch of things. The disadvantage of using a program like that, I mean, it makes your life very easy, but it also covers up some parts of the process. It means that you don't see all of the decisions that are made along the way, and you don't get a really sort of clear idea of how accurate the results are. You just end up with a spreadsheet. So be a little bit careful if you're using something like that, but it is a really efficient way of getting started with this sort of work.
Yeah, and I was thinking also maybe, of course, if you are looking at kids writing, do you in any way change their punctuation to make it more acceptable, in terms of process and
absolutely
computation?
Absolutely, parsers hate, so automatic parsers hate it if punctuation is wrong and if spelling is wrong. If it really throws them, because if they find a word that they don't know because it's not been spelt right, they just don't know what to do with it. Or if there's no full stop where there should be a full stop, it gets really confused because it will try to make sense of the sentence. And it will end up with a pause, which is just complete nonsense because it's tried to turn two sentences into one sentence. So yeah, I mean, when we didn't use the automated parsing in the end, but when we were trying out the automated parsing, we were using a version of the corpus that had all the spelling corrected and that had full stops put in the right places.
Great. Okay. We have a question from Jose Lema. How do you deal with non-English words in automatic analysis tools?
Well, it depends on the analysis that you're doing and on the software that you're using. So if it's a non-English word that comes up a lot in English, it's sort of something like, I don't know, vice versa, which it's not really an English word, but gets used in English, or et al. Those sorts of things. They might be built into the software. They might have some way of recognizing those frequent foreign words. But if it doesn't, then that's going to give you the same kind of problem as a spelling mistake. That the parser is going to get to it, or your vocabulary counter is going to get to it and not recognize it and think, well, I don't know what that is. And the parse then will probably end up as nonsense. And a vocabulary analysis would just say, oh, wow, this must be a really super low frequency word because I've never seen it before. And in a way, that's right. If you're looking at English and someone puts in a German word, then yeah, that's a really low frequency item for that context.
Okay. We have a question from Laura Marquez. Could you please let us know again which corpus have you used in the past when considering the kind of input the speakers or learners are exposed to?
Okay, so I haven't very much. That's not something that I do very much, and I think it's quite tricky. So the problem is that there aren't many big corpora of learner input. Most of the big corpora are corpora of general language use. So something like COCA, which is a sampled across all of these different areas of language use, and because it's it tries to be a balanced sample across lots of different text types, it doesn't really correspond to anybody's input in the language. But people who are interested in finding out the influence of input on learning tend a lot of the time to behave as if it was. They say, well, probably it's close. It's similar in type to what their input will be like. So people make that simplifying assumption a lot of the time, and it's difficult. It's not clear that that's really valid. There are some smaller kind of niche corpora, especially things looking at sort of speech that's directed to children, looking at mother's talk, where we can start looking at how input influences people. There are some very thick corpora of classroom data, which can look at the classroom input that people have had and the language they end up learning. The one time I tried to do this, I created my own corpus. I was thinking about my own foreign language that I was working with. And so I created a corpus of the newspapers that I read in that language over a period of 6 months. So that was meant to be representative of my input, my written input of that language over that time. But there's not very much out there that really does that job, and it's a really hard thing to do because to try and capture all of the input that a learner gets, if you think about the practicalities of that, it's really, really tricky. So for that reason, people doing that kind of thing do tend to make that simplifying assumption.
Okay, there's quite a few questions here around this notion of which is the best corpus that should be used, and questions about input. So maybe you could take one of these. I mean, again, there's quite a few of them. So sorry if we don't have the time to read all of them. But we have a couple of them from Manal Abid and Asif Qureshi. So I will read Asif's question. As L2 learners have limited time, what's your take on using smaller input corpus of course books or text for
Yeah,
creating course specific vocabulary?
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I think that, well, course specific vocabulary. So it depends on what you're trying to do there. So if your aim is to find out how does the input on that course influence their learning, then yeah, I think it's totally legitimate to take their textbooks, turn that into a corpus and say, well, you know, this is the language they've been exposed to. This is my reference corpus. I'm going to see how their use lines up with what's in this corpus. The thing that you said last, it sounded like you might be trying to make a word list for things that they should learn. And that's kind of okay if your aim is to reproduce what's already there. You know, if you want to say, you know, what is the language they are learning, let's list it for them so it's easier for them to see, then I think that's a great approach. If you're trying to say, are they getting the vocabulary that they really need? I think that needs something else, because you're really with that corpus just reproducing what they're already getting. So if your aim is to figure out, do they need something else? Do they need something beyond, you know, what we're already giving them? Do I need to be teaching them some more vocabulary? Well, then something else is needed, perhaps something representing the language that you ultimately want them to learn.
Okay. Another question from Graham Burton. Great talk. Thanks. By the way, there are so many thank you messages here, Phil.
Thank you.
So I think that you did a fantastic job today. So many of those messages. So yeah. So thank you, everyone. Really. Given the kinds of difficulties you raised in terms of task effects, at what point can or do you feel confident that you've covered all bases and your interpretations about development in writing are reliable?
Well, you know, you can never be 100% confident, can you? But I mean, I rely on the clever statisticians and the mixed effects modeling, you know, because that enables you to build in the things that you think might be having an effect into your statistical model. So, you know, if you build in individual students and individual classes and individual topics, if you build those into your statistical model as random effects, and you still find that you're getting significant results for your fixed effects, well, then to me, that shows that you can be confident that, yeah, there's something here which isn't just being influenced by specific cases, that there really is, you know, a genuine developmental pattern going on there. So to me, that's what I rely on. I have faith in those clever people who give us those wonderful statistical techniques. But, you know, again, it's I think always essential to keep going back to the details of the data, going back to your metadata and going back to the original texts, so that you have got a clear sense of how things are being affected. Because, you know, even if the overall pattern is right, the overall pattern might be disguising something that's really interesting that you notice when you look at the smaller samples.
Yeah. So I think that answer links quite nicely with Jachi Wo's question here. I think Jachi is a very quantitative person, as far as I know Jachi. So thanks very much for the brilliant presentation, Dr. Durrant. Could you share your thoughts on the differences between quantitative and qualitative corpus analysis?
I'm not sure how well that distinction works for corpus analysis, because I kind of feel like everything that I'm doing in corpus analysis is both at the same time. You know, when we quantify words, you know, we're making a simplified model of something that's inherently qualitative, right? So so we've got that. It's sort of a way of representing something that is inherently qualitative, and then as we're analyzing the graphs or the tables that come from those data, we're interpreting them in a qualitative way with our knowledge of the text, with our knowledge of the context, with our knowledge of the language. And then when we go back to the text to see what those patterns look like in particular cases, again, we're doing something that's interpretive. We're taking those overall large-scale patterns, and we're trying to interpret them. So I know I always struggle with this because I work in a department of education where people are kind of obsessed with are you a quantitative person or a qualitative person? And you're not allowed to be both, because I know that's against some rule. To me, it's kind of seamlessly always both at the same time. And I wonder if it makes sense to think about things in terms of I don't know, fine focus and broad focus, or more contextualized and less contextualized. Quantification to me, it's a form of abstraction, right? So perhaps it's about decontextualization. I think certainly setting up a binary between qualitative and quantitative, I mean, in a way it makes sense, because on one hand you're dealing with numbers, on the other hand you might be dealing with interpretations, but it might not be the best way of capturing what we do, because what we're doing is always both at the same time.
Yeah. There's so many questions. It's really difficult to choose. We have one from Aisha Al-Berim. Sorry for my pronunciation here. The question is, what statistical test did you use in this study? And I was also wondering, maybe you want to say something about mixed effects, Phil.
Okay.
Because they are becoming more and more popular in corpus linguistics, and,
Sure.
and probably it's a good opportunity to talk about that.
Sure. So yeah, so that's what I'm using. I'm using these fixed effect models, and you can think of them as being similar to well, in terms of as a consumer of these things, as someone who plugs the stuff in and gets the output, it looks a bit like a regression analysis, but with a bunch of extra variables built in, and those extra variables are built in to account for the types of clustering in the corpus that I mentioned. So the fact that one person might have multiple texts in a corpus means that the different texts submitted by that person are not independent data points, right? When you're doing a standard regression, you want each of your data points to be independent from each other, right? You want them not to be correlated with each other. But when you've got multiple texts from the same person, or as we saw in the example of the argument paper, you've got multiple texts from the same classroom, or as we saw with the science writing, you've got multiple texts on the same type of task. That means that all of those texts in that group are correlated with each other. They're not independent data points. And the idea, as I understand it, I'm not a statistician by any means, but to the extent that I've managed to grasp it, it's enabling us to control for and to see the effect of that clustering of data, right? So that means that we can build in these things like who the writer is, what the topic is, which class they're in. We can build that into the model, into our statistical model, and we can see, okay, well, how much is the identity of the writer having an effect on the thing that I'm counting? So let's say my outcome variable is noun phrase complexity. You say, well, how much is that affected by individual writers? How much is it affected by individual classes? And once all of that's been put into the model, how much then is left over that's actually accounted for by the thing that I'm most interested in, which is the development over time or differences in genre. It's good stuff. I do recommend people get into it. The best example I've seen recently, by the way, is in Bodo Winter's recent book on statistics for linguistics. Fantastic book, very, very clear. And that's a really, really nice introduction to doing mixed effects modeling.
Great, beautiful. That's a great tip, by the way. Yeah, and that also I think is something that we get to read more and more in corpus linguistics books and handbooks. So these is called for more multifactorial research designs.
Yes, I think the days of chi-square are behind us now.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. We have a question from Rachel Whitaker. Continuing with the noun phrases, I was surprised that at year 11, the average length was 2.5. It's 2.5 or 25? 2.5, yeah. Or did I misread that?
Let's go back and have a look. because I don't know off the top of my head. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, here it is. Yeah, so the average length just over 2.5. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me very much because, you know, even at that age, what happens as the children get older actually is not that all of their noun phrases get longer. What happens is, you know, your normal noun phrase, like the median noun phrase, let's say the most popular length of noun phrase, kind of stays the same as they get older. That doesn't change very much. The reason for the increase is that older writers also use some very, very long noun phrases. All right. So that increase is not because all of their noun phrases are long. It's because there's kind of a tail of really, really long noun phrases. So, you know, if you had, you know, all of your noun phrases were long in the text, that would make your text, you know, pretty unreadable. But the average gets pushed up by the kind of relatively small number of very long ones. So it doesn't surprise me very much that, you know, the average is only just over kind of 2.5. And it's not, you know, a substantially, you know, it's a significant increase, but it's not a big increase. You know, it's an increase from what, 1.5 to just over 2.5.
There's a few questions here, maybe 3 or 4, around your evaluation of the magazines section in COCA. So some of those questions probably, once you look at the validity of, I suppose, of the construct magazine. So maybe you have thoughts on that.
I think it's, you know, people need to be skeptical about that, because, you know, I think that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make here, is that, you know, you can set up a measure of something, you know, like word frequency or like, you know, register appropriateness, based on, you know, a really high quality reference corpus like the COCA, and you think, ah, great, okay, this is measuring this. But until you do a lot of digging, you know, when you do a lot of digging, you might find out that that reference corpus is telling you something different from what you thought it was telling you. And I think my message would ultimately be that you just can't take those things for granted. You can't just take a corpus tool or just take a reference corpus and say, well, you know, this is what it says on the label, so therefore it must be this. You know, this, you know, if I look at COCA, it tells me that, you know, this part of the corpus is magazines, so there must be something distinctively magazine-like about the things in here. So that will tell me something distinctive about children, you know, the way children are using registered vocabulary. And, you know, that kind of makes sense. But, you know, when you look under the hood of COCA, you find all of this complexity which can challenge those constructs that you're working with. So yeah, I would say that, you know, that measure of the magazine register, that's something that I question now. You know, when I put the analysis together, I thought, well, yeah, that makes sense. And similarly for the others, you know, if you look at, you know, the academic part, you know, you'd really want to look into, well, you know, is there bias within the academic part of the COCA corpus? Because there is. I mean, you know, we know that word lists based, you know, academic word lists based on COCA, they are skewed towards particular disciplines. So, you know, what we're calling an academic register in COCA might not be a generic academic register. You know, it might be registered, it might be skewed towards particular disciplines, might be skewed towards particular text types, which, you know, which happen to be readily available and easily downloadable and so easy to include into a corpus.
Yeah, and I suppose, especially for PhD students, maybe it is a good idea to try to know thy corpus very well. Just try to really know, you know, everything about what's going on.
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because, you know, you get your corpus, you're really excited to do the analysis and to get the results and to make the graphs and say, what's the answer to my research question?
Exactly.
And you just want to jump on and do that thing. But I mean, yeah, okay, you know, jump on and do it. But, you know, if you jump on and do it, make sure that you then sit down and have a good look at the corpus and figure out what's going on inside it. And it may be that, you know, what I find a lot of the time is that by doing the big scale analysis, it pulls out something which makes me look at a part of the corpus and makes me investigate. Like that was what happened with the magazine thing, right? You know, I get my result from the corpus. I think, well, that's weird. What's going on there? And it's that kind of striking result that stands out and wasn't quite what you were expecting, that forces you to go back, and you're then motivated. You know, you're motivated to look for a particular thing. You know, no one's going to sit down and read Coca. You know, no one's going to sit down and check every text in it and where it came from. Yeah, that's not possible. But what you can do is, once you've identified something that wasn't quite what you were expecting to happen, or, you know, let's say you have found what you wanted to happen, but you know, you're now looking at a specific thing and you know what you need to go and look for, and then you can go and check that out in the corpus.
Yeah. We have a question from Joyce Lim here. Hi, Joyce, by the way. So thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm looking at L2 writing development of L1 Korean speakers in the Cambridge Learner Corpus. And I also found that learners in the higher proficiency don't necessarily make more use of low frequency words. I agree with you that it's probably hard to make generalizations based on high or low frequency of words. Then, and here is the question, then would you say that there is any benefit of looking at lexical sophistication, even considering that we could control factors such as topics and so on?
Well, I think we don't want to lose lexical sophistication as a construct, but we probably need to change how we think about it. So there's a couple things there. One is that we can't just reduce it to frequency. You know, as you know, I tried to show in this presentation, as you found in your own research, we can't just say, well, it's frequency, because it's not just frequency, and frequency really depends on what's in the reference corpus. The other way that I think we need to change it is that something that I'm finding from my own research is that it's not, sophistication is not the use of individual words that are sophisticated. It's the whole set of words that are in the text and the range of those words. So when I looked at, so, you know, looking at these register stuff, looking in particular, say, at academic words, and, you know, we could say, well, you know, these academic words, they're, let's say a word that is more academic is more sophisticated, let's say, you know, so you're writing in an academic register, therefore use of an academic word is sophisticated. So I thought, well, you know, if someone is scoring higher, if they're getting a high score for the use of academic words, perhaps that means that the words they use are more academic than the words someone else uses. So in other words, they're using words which, if I go back to that slide, so we see where I've got these things quantified, words are more or less academic. So the word article, for example, is more academic than the word opposition. And the word bias is even more academic than the word article. So an initial thought might be, well, someone who's more sophisticated would use words like bias rather than words like opposition. But that's actually not what happens, at least in my data. You know, I didn't find that individual words were more academic-like in the older children's writing than the younger children's writing. You know, if you take types, if you just count each word once, there's no difference across different year groups. But there's a difference in the amount of academic words that are being used across the length of the text. So I think that means that we can't see sophistication and diversity as being orthogonal to each other, quite often there's this idea that you've got diversity on the one hand, the range of words, and then you've got the sophistication of those words, and that those are two different things. And I think that's probably wrong. I think sophistication is something that probably comes out across the length of a whole text and depends on the whole set of words that are being used, rather than being something that we can attribute to individual words and say this word's sophisticated, this word's not sophisticated. It's about that whole set of words and how they work together.
Yeah, which is, by the way, one of the findings that you talk about in your book here.
Thank you for the plug.
Sorry, it's difficult with the background. Okay, brilliant. Well, I think it's already late. We have so many questions here. I suppose many of these questions also want to know more about your expertise and how you do things. And I am pretty sure that Phil will be happy to probably
you know where to find me.
Yeah, exactly. To get back to you. But anyway, the best I suppose the best way to go about these things probably is to get to read Phil's research, right? Which again is so inspiring in so many ways. Okay, so I know I have a lot of requests here. We will make these talks available as soon as possible. It will take a little bit of time. We want to make the 4 talks available, so don't worry about that. So this will be available. Well, thank you everyone, and thanks for your very kind words here, and especially thank you so much, Phil, for your generosity today, and to share your research and sharing your research with us today.
Well, thanks for setting it all up, Pasquale. It's been good, and thank you everybody for coming. It's been great to share some time with you.
Brilliant. Okay, well, everyone, if you are in Europe, I suppose, have a great evening. If you are in America, South America, have a nice afternoon. If you are in China, I believe we have people in China. I don't know, you just need to go to bed.
Yeah.
Just hit the bed now. All right, so thank you everyone.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you everyone.